So there are people who raise the bar in your field with the work that they do, like our next speaker did with DEUS EX Human Revolution. There are people in the field who raise the bar in how you do your job, like our next speaker did with essentially defining and really evolving the role of narrative designer to the point where it is an invaluable part of any dev team. And then are the people who do both. And these are the people that the rest of us in the field look up to. And our next speaker is someone whom I personally have had the honor of working with, whom I admire tremendously, and who has been an inspiration to me in my career. Ladies and gentlemen, Mary DeMarle.
Wow, that was really, really sweet. So, thank you everyone for coming. And my talk today is about creating meaningful game stories, because I am a storyteller. But I actually think I probably should have called it creating meaningful game experiences. So if you're not into writing, I still think that you can get a lot out of it, or at least I hope. And if not, hopefully you'll just find the slides fun. So we'll see. So, the purpose of a storyteller is not to tell you how to think, but to give you questions to think upon. Now, I love that quote. I love it for a variety of reasons. One of which is because the more that I think about it, the more I feel that Brandon Sanderson is speaking specifically about me and my role, specifically as a storyteller working in games. And I believe that if I can hold on to this quote and I can use it as kind of a rule every time I start to create a story-based game, I might actually achieve something that I've been trying to do for a very long time. Something that I think every writer, narrative designer, game and creative director who is working on narratively driven games is trying to do. But I'll get back to that. First, for the benefit of those who don't really know me, even though Rich gave me that wonderful introduction, my name is Mary DeMarle, and I am the Executive Narrative Director at EIDOS Montreal. And I am currently in charge of developing stories, overseeing writing efforts, and ensuring the quality, consistency, and continuity of all narrative endeavors in the DEUS EX universe. Before writing DEUS EX Human Revolution, and before joining EIDOS back in 2005, I worked as both a freelance and in-house writer on a variety of AAA titles, most of which you can see here. All of this really just says that I have been working in games for a very long time, 17 years to be exact. And as I was thinking about that, and I was looking back at those years and thinking about what I wanted to talk about today, and I looked at some of the other talks that I've given, I realized, a little bit to my surprise actually, that the industry has changed. 17 years ago, writers were an afterthought on the team. The term narrative designer hadn't really been thought up yet. And the debate was about whether or not games needed stories. Today, teams are actively asking for writers to come in early. And we're debating what the best structure for writing stories in games might be. Increasingly, story is being seen as an asset in games. And many of the things that we game writers once aspired to are now assumed. More and more people seem to be asking, can games tell meaningful stories? Can they, in fact, be art? Well, you know what? I'm not really interested in that debate. And I think the question about whether or not games can tell meaningful stories is the wrong question to ask. I think there are better questions to be asking, questions that are being asked by many of us who are working on narratively driven games. Questions like, How do we combine narrative and gameplay to tell more meaningful stories? Can we use gameplay mechanics to evoke emotions and touch people on a deep and meaningful level? How do we offer meaningful choices to create powerful, narratively driven game experiences? I'm not sure that I have the answers to those questions. I probably don't. But I do have some thoughts about games, about game making, and about the power of story that I would like to share today. So, let's get on with it. I'd like to start this section of my talk by taking a few minutes to share why I, as a storyteller, am so excited by the potential and fascinated by games as a storytelling medium. To me, games have a power that other storytelling media don't, because of the way they encourage players to experiment and play. I step into a game world, and the first thing I want to do is experiment with the controller. I want to figure out how can I move around and what I have to do to shoot things, or in my case, to avoid shooting things, unless they really piss me off. And then I really want to shoot them. Because my view of the game world is limited to what I'm seeing on screen, the next thing that I want to do is explore. I want to find out what the boundaries of the game world are, figure out what kind of rules and systems I'm dealing with here, and discover how I can manipulate them to get what I want. It's at this point that the game begins to respond, throwing up opponents or putting obstacles in my way that force me to make decisions and choose between one course of action or another. And if I'm really lucky, the game's responses might force me to react to my own actions and the repercussions of what I've done, or confront me with the consequences of my decisions in a way that makes me learn something valuable about myself. Think about that for a second. Games create an alternate reality, a different world, a lie, really, where I am free to experiment and discover. Writer Alan Moore once wrote, "Artists use lies to tell the truth. Yes, I created a lie. But because you believed it, you found something true about yourself." But I said I wasn't interested in debating games as art. So, the reason that I think that games have power comes down basically to two things: interactivity and the gameplay loop. Interactivity comes from gameplay systems and the fact that nothing can actually happen in the game world without some kind of player input. The gameplay loop, although mechanical in nature, has a mental and perhaps psychological component to it. I encounter a difficult challenge. I must observe, interpret, and deduce how to use my skills or acquire the abilities that will help me to overcome the challenge. Then I act to see if my assumptions were correct, and if they were, I overcome the challenge, gain a reward, and I move on. So how and where does story fit into this? Well, it's easy to put a narrative wrapper around this loop to make it resemble a story. For instance, I was planting in my garden one day when a wave of zombies appeared. So I used some plant food to accelerate my peas, and then the zombies all died. And then I got a new bok choy plant so I could take on the next wave of zombies. Well, that's a story, kind of. It's really more of a retelling of and then events. It doesn't have a lot of meaning, and it's not going to really impact me in any kind of deep, meaningful way. In order to do that, we first have to understand the mechanics of story. Now, there are a lot of great books that you can read on this subject, and a number of really good talks on it as well. In fact, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time or effort here, but I will point you to a fabulous GDC Next talk by Jeremy Bernstein called Reimagining Story Structure, Moving Beyond 3 Acts in Narrative Design. In his talk, Jeremy tries to unite story and gameplay by defining story like this. Someone who wants something badly, the objective, and is having a hard time getting it, the gameplay. Now, this definition inherently implies a question. Will the characters get what they want? And it's the audience's desire to know how and if the characters are going to get what they want that creates dramatic tension. A good story sustains dramatic tension by constantly escalating things until a climactic moment is reached and a startling revelation is made. This reveal resolves the initial tension at the same time that it twists the story in another direction, thereby introducing a new dramatic tension and enabling the dramatic story loop to begin all over again. Now, if you look at this sequence in another way, it becomes pretty obvious that the mechanics of story look an awful lot like the mechanics of a gameplay loop. In my opinion, recognizing this is the first step in designing a meaningful game story. Because of the way that it enables game and narrative designers to break story into specific sequences of gameplay and merge the story and gameplay together within a single map or a single level. Because you see, in a game, every map, every level has its own piece of storyline. And if you can identify that piece of story before building the level or the map, along with all the critical twists and reveals that need to be made to match the dramatic and to create the dramatic tension in the story, you can literally blueprint out your level in a way that ensures story and gameplay will merge. Let me explain. What you see right here is a small portion of the blueprint that my team created when we were making Deus Ex Human Revolution, specifically the part that relates to the manufacturing map in the game. The piece of storyline for the map is indicated here. But you can't see it, so I'll zoom in on it so you can. When you look at it closely, you see that this piece of storyline can actually be broken into one or more specific gameplay sequences. We decided on 2. We probably could have gone with 3. And other pieces of story or other maps in the game may require even more. Each of these sequences has events or goals that must be encountered or completed by the player in order to fulfill the dramatic needs of the story. Now notice how much those key story events look like story beat reveals. Now, each of those sequences can be further broken up into one or more blocks of gameplay. In the case of our first sequence, we went with 5. Each block describes a situation, be it a cutscene, a scripted event, a dialogue, or gameplay challenge, that's needed to fulfill the goals of the entire sequence. And if you look at those statements closely, you'll see that breaking the story into those distinct blocks of gameplay enabled our level designers to merge story with gameplay while keeping the dramatic tension of the story loop intact. Blueprinting our game story in this way allowed us to accomplish quite a few things. But what I like the most about this process is that it forced us to define our story not by how the characters experience it, but rather by how the players will experience it. It made us think about the player at all times, how he or she was going to come into contact with the story, and what kind of actions they might take to impact or change it. John Steinbeck once wrote, "A man who tells secrets or stories must think of who is hearing or reading, for a story has as many versions as it has readers. Everyone takes what he wants from it, or can from it, and thus changes it to his measure. Some pick out parts and reject the rest. Some strain the story through their mesh of prejudice. Some paint it with their own delight. A story must have some points of contact with the reader to make him feel at home in it. Only then can he accept wonders." Now, if you really look at that quote, you'll realize that Steinbeck is actually talking about two things that are important to creating a deeply impactful story. But before I get to the second one, I have one more thing to say about blueprinting the game story into sequences of gameplay and story blocks. And that is that when you do it, you're really making the player an active participant in your story. His or her own actions are driving the plot forward. This means that game mechanics are also an essential part of the story experience. In my opinion, understanding your game's mechanics, what a player can and cannot do in a game, is the second crucial step to designing a truly meaningful game story. Allow me to explain why. First, if we jump back to dramatic tension for a moment, in a story, dramatic tension occurs because of a pull between two emotions, hope and fear. We hope the characters will get what they want, but we fear that they won't. Story events are then created and set against each other to constantly pull the player's emotions, or the audience's emotions, in one direction or the other. But in a game, dramatic tension comes from wondering if the abilities the game gives you and your skill in using them are strong enough to overcome the game's challenges. Too much challenge, and the game becomes frustrating. Too much ability, and the game becomes boring. We can therefore use game mechanics to enhance and possibly even create the dramatic tension that we need players to feel at any point in our story. If we want them to be afraid that they won't get what they want, we up the challenge. If we want them to feel more hopeful that they will get what they want, and by extension that the hero character who they are playing will get what he wants in the story, then we give them some more abilities. Gameplay challenges evoke fear, and gameplay abilities evoke hope. It's as simple as that. Of course, game mechanics aren't just about taking out enemies and overcoming obstacles. We can also think outside the box and use them to create scenarios that encourage players to care more deeply about the story characters. Want your player to feel more connected to the hero character's girlfriend? Encourage him to sit on a couch and watch To Kill a Mockingbird with her for as long as he wants. Want your player to feel more connected and want to evoke a stronger father-son relationship or connection in your story, a game, ask him to play baseball with the hero character's son for a while. As long as we focus on the emotions we want players to experience in our games and our stories, we're really only limited by what we can come up with, what we can creatively do with these game mechanics. Now, you may have noticed that I said encourage and ask right then. That was very deliberate because it leads me to the next thing I want to talk about, engaging the player. I heard it said recently, and I believe that it's very true, that the amount of time and energy a player puts into a game depends on how autonomously motivated they feel. Do they feel as if they are really driving the story forward? Or are they being manipulated to do something that they don't really want to do? Do they have enough agency to do what they want and to be in control of their destiny? Now, if you've worked in this industry for very long, you know that one of the biggest complaints against story is that it takes away from player agency. It forces players into a very structured path from which there can be little or no deviation. Well, in my opinion, that's simply not true. Stories can allow for choice, and they can allow for deviation from a single critical path without lessening their impact, as several games in recent years have shown. Second of all, and here's the kicker, feeling autonomous does not mean being independent or having complete freedom or lacking any kind of structure. It simply means feeling in control of your choices and endorsing the path that you're on. Now, think about that for a minute. I mean, how many of you out there are married? There's a few. You, in deciding to get married, autonomously decided to give up some independence, to become dependent on another person. But did that make you feel less in control of your life? Did it make you feel like you were doing something you wanted to do? Hopefully, the answer is it made you feel better. But we'll leave that for there. The point is, it's a choice, and you are choosing it, and it isn't about being independent. And in terms of structure, I believe that players want structure. There's nothing worse than being thrown into the middle of a room with no direction, with no understanding, and just having to figure it out and going around. I mean, sometimes that can be fun, but after a while, you need the canvas. You need to understand the canvas that you're in so that you can actually become more creative. And I believe that story gives you that structure. It gives you the outline for you to become autonomous within. And I think that's what players want. They want to feel autonomous within the structure of the story. So how can we enable and encourage more autonomy in a story-driven game? Well, I'm actually going to sidestep that question for just a minute and quote Steinbeck again, because I think that his next statement is very applicable right now. If a story is not about the hearer, he will not listen. A great lasting story is about everyone, or it will not last. The strange and foreign is not interesting, only the deeply personal and familiar. Stories have power because they get us to identify with the protagonist, to find something in his or her struggles that we can relate to, even if we don't particularly like those characters, at least we see something in them that resonates with us. And because it resonates with us, we are able to go on an emotional journey. We're able to experience life through someone else's eyes for a while and learn things that we might not learn in our own lives because we're not following that path. Stories take us on an emotional journey that enables us to discover universal truths about life, about the human condition, and even about ourselves and how we feel about the world. Now, it sounds simple to say it, but if we're going to encourage player autonomy in our stories, we first need to engage players by crafting stories that they can relate to. Stories about people, not about events. Stories about how people are reacting to the events and the new technologies. Stories that say something about what it means to be human. Once we've done that, then we can start talking about autonomy. So, how can we encourage autonomy in narratively driven games? By offering choices. Now, in my experience, when you talk about incorporating choice into a story-based game, it usually gets people's heads spinning, especially producers. You hear a lot of concern over the fact that branching storylines are likely to explode budgets and ruin schedules, and that you're creating assets that only a small portion of your audience is going to see, so why should we put the time and effort into that? You hear it from artists. Why should I put this much work into that when I'd rather make sure people are seeing what I've created? And it's true. If you're not careful, it is very true. In Deus Ex Human Revolution, giving players choices during a simple hostage situation. Excuse me. I lost my train. Giving players choices during a simple hostage situation led to 6 possible player actions, most of which we anticipated, but several of which we didn't. But we did before we finished the game, thank goodness. And 7 possible outcomes. We thought you had 3 choices. You could let the character, the hostage taker, go. You could try and talk him down and get him to give up the hostage, or you could fight him. And if you fought him, the 2 we realized you could do is you could knock him out and you could kill him, but we also didn't take into account that the player might kill the hostage or knock out the hostage. And how do we deal with that? So incorporating just one moment of choice resulted in 7 different outcomes, all of which had to eventually be dealt with and woven back into the story. But in my opinion, we game designers have to make choices too. We have to decide when and where it's worth it to put the money to allow player choices to change the storyline. And if you blueprint out your story ahead of time, you can identify the most relevant moments and you can find ways to bring them in, and you can determine where the money should go and how the effort should be spent. Because ultimately, the story will be more impactful to the player when it takes into account his actions and it adapts to them. There's nothing cooler than trying something in a game and thinking that the game developers probably didn't come up with that, and discovering, oh my God, it worked. Look at that. And knowing that the story adjusted to it. At the same time, as we're putting in choices, we can and we should use player choices to show them more about themselves and more about the game world. What you see here is an example of a role-playing choice in a game. It's very common for dialogue choices to be presented to players to ask them, how do you want to deal with this other character? Do you want to be aggressive? Do you want to be practical? Dialogue choices like this that offer different attitudes or tones that player can make, in my opinion, they can add so much enjoyment to the game, but not just because we're allowing the player to decide what kind of a person he or she wants to be. They're actually tapping into, if we use them right, they are tapping into the power of a game to experiment and try out different things. Because when you try them out, it's like you're putting on a different mask. You get to act in a way that may or may not be the way you really want to act in the world, and you get to see how that action is being reacted to by the players, by the other characters in the world. And discovering that actually enables us to learn something about ourselves and about how other people are likely to respond. Now, the thing is, we have to remember that we should also, when we're creating these dialogue choices, not just think about it from the standpoint of, okay, I'm going to write this dialogue so the player can be like James Bond, suave and sophisticated, or, Bauer and be brash and stuff, or be very professional, whatever, and allow the player. We should be using those opportunities to show them more about the characters that they are dealing with in the story, because different people will react in different ways. Some people, if you act very aggressively towards them, it's going to get their back up. And that's going to come from who they are as a character. And they're going to respond in a way that will say, whoa, okay, wait a minute, maybe you shouldn't be dealing with this character in that way. But another character, when you treat them very emotionally or very roughly and try and smack them down, they might actually just take it and walk away. So we should be, when we're creating these dialogue choices, we should be looking at it as opportunities to A, allow the player to experiment, and B, show them the other characters in the world and show them what kind of repercussions those actions have and how they affect other people. But we have to be very careful when we're doing this that we're not hiding a choice, a lack of choice within a choice. We shouldn't have in these dialogue choices, and it's one of the common problems when you're writing branching dialogues, you have to get your story across. So a lot of writers sometimes will sit there and write these choices thinking, oh, it's for the player, but the character they're responding to will say the exact same thing because they have to. Why? Why can't different attitudes give different bits of information along the way? So there are other ways to give choice in games, not just dialogue. So let's think about some of those other things. What kinds of choices are we talking about here? Well, typically, and I could be wrong about this, but this is what I think, choices in games fall into one of two categories. There are choices that tap into the strategy of how you want to play. Do you want a sword or do you want a crossbow? Do you want a gun or do you want a stun gun? Do you want to play aggressively, guns blazing, or do you want to sneak around and not be seen? Games spend a lot of effort, and game designers spend a lot of effort balancing those kind of choices for players in a game. But there's a second kind of choice as well. There are choices that tap into the player's moral and ethical values, and at their core are more coming out of the emotions. Do I want to save a character or do I want to let him die? Do I want to act aggressively and scare this player, or do I want to be very affectionate with them and cozy up to them? Sometimes strategic choices can have an emotional component to it. Maybe I like what it feels like to be that archer in this medieval world, and that's why I'm choosing it, because I feel better. And maybe I prefer to be, I forget where I'm going with that, so I'm going to stop and take water. And in my opinion, both strategic and emotional choices are valuable in a game, and they should both be included in a game, because they're both going to enable the player to feel more engagement and feel like he's having a lot more fun in this, and that he's having his choices are making a difference. But we have to be careful, because we shouldn't be comparing apples with oranges. Don't ask a player to choose between something that affects the strategy of how he plays and something that taps into his moral values. And I'm not saying this because most players are likely to choose the strategy because they want to win. I'm not saying it for that reason, although it may be true or may not be true. Why you shouldn't do it is because it devalues both choices. If I decide that I'm going to give up the gameplay boost in order to save the person and feel good about myself, somehow down the line, the game designer is going to have to rebalance the game to make it that I didn't need that power-up, or that I could find another one. And that means that I didn't really need that at all. It's a false choice. We should try and avoid as much as possible. On the other hand, asking them to take this apple or this apple is very powerful. Am I going to save this person or that person? That's going to affect me. It's a judgment that I'm making, and it's going to have meaning for me. So, once again, to design a meaningful game story and offer choices, we need to bear in mind those rules. We need to offer and adapt to player choices. Choose the moments carefully. We can use the choice to expose more about the game world and also more about the player and how they feel. And we shouldn't be mixing apples with oranges, as I said. So the last thing, of course, choice implies, is that if you make choices, there have to be consequences. You have to see the consequences of what you've done. And I put up the picture of Breaking Bad just because I love it. But the thing to bear in mind when we are putting in the consequences, that reactions and consequences don't have to be what you expect. When I was traveling in Paris, I think it was Greece. I was in the airport at Greece. And there was a cleaning lady, a Greek cleaning lady there, and there was a tourist, American or an English tourist. And they were leaving the country, and they had a handful of Greek coins. And they saw the cleaning lady, and they went up to her, and they were like, "Hey, here, you take these coins. I don't need them. I can't use them where I'm going." And they gave them to the cleaning lady, and they turned around and left. And what they didn't see was that as soon as they turned around and walked away, the cleaning lady spit at them. Because they thought they were doing something kind, but the cleaning lady saw it as an insult. She pocketed the change, but she still spit. So reactions don't always have to be what you expect, but they must make sense in a narrative way. They must make sense with the characters that you're creating, with the rules of the world that you're creating. And when we show you the consequences, we need to remember that we should show them, but we should not judge the player. We should not say, "You're being a bad person for doing that." Why? Well, I've got one more quote for you. Maybe it's the last, maybe it's not. We'll see. This one's by Walter Benjamin. It is half the art of storytelling to keep a story free from explanation as one reproduces it. The most extraordinary things, marvelous things, are related with the greatest accuracy, but the psychological connection of the event is not forced on the reader. It is left to him to interpret the way he understands them. If we show consequences without judgment, we are enabling players to take from it what they feel is important, what they feel is relevant, and they will learn from that, and they will feel the meaning of the story coming through. So those are the last steps that I think for now, until next time, designing a meaningful game story, another way to do it. I will say that step number 3, focusing the narrative on a deeply personal and universally familiar events, is really probably step 1, but it came out as 3 in my presentation. So I said a lot of things, and I think in conclusion, I'm just going to sum it all up like this. Stories have power because they allow us to experience life through another person's eyes. Games have power because they allow us to experiment, explore, test the rules, put on different personalities, and discover consequences, and discover in those consequences how far we're willing to go. So what will happen when we're able to consistently produce meaningful, story-driven game experiences? Well, the purpose of a storyteller is not to tell you how to think, but to give you questions to think upon. And I probably finished early, so thank you for listening. So I don't know how much time we have, but I'll take questions if anybody has any. And if you don't, I like that. Yes.
Prior to step 1, you showed us a document on your PowerPoint slide. Did we get our hands on that?
No. It is actually that picture. I can show it to you again. I think it's way back in the beginning, so I think it might be better to do it like this and find it. That was the blueprint. You're talking about the blueprint. Ooh, it's going to be hard to see it unless I do it again. Because I like animations. Got it? Okay. Yeah, this is actually, and it is a really small portion of it, because underneath, what we do with the blueprint is we call out every single scripted event, every single dialogue choice, not dialogue choice, but all the characters that you're going to interact with within a certain scene. And this was for the entire game. So when we did it in Excel, and when you see it, in order to see it, it's a really wieldy document to work with, because in order to see it all at once, it's like this big. But when you expand it, so anyway. But no, unfortunately, I can't share it. I can only show it in moments like this. But, so.
When in production was that document nailed down, and how did it evolve over time, in terms of the production flow?
We did that as soon as we had the story. We were in pre-production. We had finished our conception phase. We spent a couple of months developing story, and then as soon as the story was done, we did the blueprint. And the blueprint basically allows us to merge the story with gameplay, and no maps are made until the blueprint is done. And it's a really useful tool, because the other thing that happened is once we had it all, it allowed us to see the scope of our project. And we discovered, for instance, on Deus Ex, we originally had 5 cities you were supposed to go to, or 5 countries. You were supposed to go to India. And we realized that there were too many assets to create. So we then had to fold all the story events from India into a return trip to Hengsha, China. And we were able to do that, and we patched that in, and we reworked the blueprint at that point and finished it. Actually, they held off production by 2 weeks until we could finish it, and then they started production from there. And we had additional changes afterwards because we still had to do a big scope, but that really helped us to know what we needed to do. Yes? Have I ever had to change a story because of the way a non-player character acted? No, we've never had to do that. First of all, if it was a non-player character, then we would probably cut that character to keep the story. So no, I've never run into that situation, no. Decisions as products of? Mm-hmm. Oh, okay. Well, in terms of our blueprint, what we did is we identified certain moments like that, like the hostage situation, and we thought up all the ways that the gameplay could have affected it, and we thought of all the ways that we could present it from a story aspect, and then we kind of allow it to the player to do what he wants. But because we knew what those choices could be from a gameplay standpoint, we were able to then predict it later down the line and loop it back in. So, in the back, against the wall. I've never actually worked on massively multiplayer games, so I don't really feel that I can answer that question and reconciling it. I've spent all my career on single player and stuff, but it is an interesting challenge to deal with, but I wouldn't feel comfortable answering that. Yes, and I'll come to this side. I've actually not had to deal with storyline creep because of the process. We have, again, I'm going to say the blueprint was the process. It really kind of helped us to focus what was the most important steps and what were the most important. I do create really big stories and really big stories, and then I have to cut them down, but we're able to do that before we start. Okay. Yeah, emergent story, I'm kind of a mix of that. I do believe that, there's a couple things I believe about emergent story. I believe that as human beings are kind of programmed to detect pattern and make a story about it. So I do believe that when we have emergent events happening, it's just human nature to make connections and make that story work. But I also feel that that's not necessarily the strongest story, because story, as I said, it does have those dramatic, to make the dramatic tension work, it needs those moments, and a lot of times it ends up becoming more of an and-then kind of series, which an and-then storyline, things aren't causally connected. And we might want to make them causally connected, but it's a little difficult, I think. But I do believe in emergent gameplay, and I love it when it happens, and it adds to it, but I don't see it as a driving overall narrative. Wait, I said I'd go over here. Yes? Again, I think it's that there are certain things that are universal that we will find. Like, one of the most important things is finding what is something from a story perspective everyone can relate to. Everyone knows what it's like to lose someone they love. So everyone knows what it's like to have, be angry with a best friend or stuff like that. So you find those things, but then in building the world, because you actually got a second thing in there. When you're building a world, to make it an immersive world, you need to have all of the disciplines, the artists, the narrative designers, the programmers, everyone, they all need to be working to tell the same story. One of the things that we did is we would produce what we called, well, at first it was called the match plan, and then when I did it for our DLC, we called it the visual storytelling document. And what it does is it takes each location and it tells you what is the emotion we want the player to get out of this, and what is the story we want. So, for instance, for the DLC, we had a military base, and I wrote in this document that this is a military base. There would be a room here for special operations. You might see maps on the walls. You might see this, etc. And this particular room belongs to this character who has a brother, blah, blah, blah. And then the artists go in and read that document, and they create from their own versions. Like I might have pictured, I pictured maybe the sister was a redhead, but they've created like somebody totally different, much more beautifully than I could. But I think it's all the team working together that actually helps, because you got so many people working on it that it resonates with everybody in a different way. So, in the back. I'm kind of two minds of that, because I do believe you have to have something of an illusion for some of the choices. I said don't mask a lack of choice with a choice, but you are, as long as what you're doing is still having an effect or a repercussion, then it is still a choice. You could argue that The Walking Dead they really change their story based on your decisions, but they do, because your decisions are impacting the characters, and the characters are changing, and you're seeing that reaction from it. You're not necessarily going into this massively branching storyline, but we're giving you the sense, and when you experience it, I don't know what all the other answers would be. I only know what's the current one, and if it feels compelling to me, then I don't care. It felt like I made a choice, and it felt like I had a reaction. So the key is showing the reaction, adapting to it and showing it, but not necessarily branching the storyline, and ways like that. So, is someone up here?
Do you have any notion of the scope, and even just a ballpark number of the scope of this document, like how many words it was, or if you were to diagram the plot with how you did on that one slide with, here's a choice and here all the ways you solve it, like how large would that diagram be?
No, the thing we did, I don't really know. I mean, it's a massive document, and it's very unwieldy. And then what happened after we did it is, and we learned from this, because we didn't do it, but the testing department then said, we need to create a chart that maps all those changes. And so the testing department created some massive, like Venn diagram kind of thing for that. But I honestly don't know. I mean, I think we were into like the triple cells by the time we finished at the end. Like we were in like cell XXX or something like that. So it was big. Yes?
Thinking about replayability of your stories. And so you had David Cage with Heavy Rain up there. And if you have a game like Heavy Rain or perhaps The Walking Dead, where the designers kind of, your first go through is sort of like the primary one for you, and you can go back and replay it, but Cage has basically said, I want you to kind of go through Heavy Rain, and the way you go through it is yours. How do you deal with giving these really branching options, but having the player want to go back through all of that story and try to...
I think if players want to go back and do it, they should. And it's fun. I think we've heard, I don't know what the record is of how many times people have replayed Deus Ex Human Revolution and still haven't necessarily found all all the different branches. So I think if they want to, that's great. I also think that if they had an amazing experience in one way, maybe they don't want to. Maybe they got the best ending and they don't want to change it. I have a friend who, with Deus Ex, she played Deus Ex, and then The Missing Link came out, and The Missing Link is the DLC, and the storyline kind of fits inside Deus Ex. So in the director's cut, you can play it all together. But she hasn't played it yet because she was so happy with her decision at the end that she didn't want to go back and change it and learn anything new. And that's great. I mean, what we're doing is we're creating media for individual people. We're hoping to sell it to everyone, but it's really a personal thing, and every person who pays the money and buys it should get the experience they want out of it. And if that means replaying it again and again and again, great. But if not, that's good too. So. The choice interactions between the NPCs. That's a broad question. I'm trying to think of the best way to answer that. The first thing was we identified some of the key moments, like the hostage situation. I think we had, I'm forgetting now, I think there were like 6 conversation gameplays that you could do in the game. We originally wanted 50, but then we tried to write them, and then it got down to like 10, and then we cut some. But anyway, we identified them early on the blueprint, and we were able to build those in. And then when it came to actually writing, side quests were not included in here. So side quests got added, and then we tried to find ways to make the side quests come in. And within the actual dialogue writing for choice, that came out of the writers themselves would just start writing and say, oh, this is a good spot for a choice. And I wonder what the character will say, and we explored it down different paths. So that was kind of how we dealt with it. So, yes.
So this is clearly very player-driven, and the philosophy is very player-driven. Did you map out the other NPCs, Gameplay Reminder, and their story arcs at all, or was that just how they interact with the player?
We didn't actually, I mean, we had a separate team doing side quests. We really learned a lot making Deus Ex. We kind of, I mean, what I think my boss said, making the first one required naivete, and making the second one requires courage. So we didn't really know what we were doing at points. And with side quests, we actually had a team who was working on them. And it was going, so we had people who were totally in charge of that. And I overviewed all the stories that were going in. I believe they did something of their own in which they would map those reactions and stuff. But a lot of it was winging it, I think. So, and we get there.
What is the worst game story you've ever seen and why?
Pac-Man.
I don't know. I don't like to have worst or favorites. I don't know.
Hypothetically, if you could answer that, what would you say?
See, the problem for me is that I'm so story-driven that even if it's bad, I want to know where it's going to go. So I seriously don't have an answer for that. I mean, to me, what's a really bad story is one that A, doesn't resonate, doesn't connect with me, but I'm also very intellectual, so I often like to follow just pure intellectual stories to see where they're going, even though there's no connection to it. So I don't know. Anything that's like just totally in the end makes no sense. I can't get into that. So, yes. It depends on what choice C is. That can be completely powerful. We actually had that in Deus Ex where, with the character Frida Malik, you could save her, but it didn't seem like you could. I'm sorry I didn't play Mass Effect, so I can't answer that. It's kind of a what? Yeah, unfortunately, I can't really comment on Mass Effect. Are we out of time? Oh, I think we're out of time. Sorry, guys. I was waiting for someone to tell me. Thank you.